I was 22 when my father handed me the deed, his weathered fingers trembling not with age, but with what I now recognize as shame. The paper felt heavier than it should have, weighted with his disappointment, and my mother's barely concealed disgust. "It's yours now," he said, unable to meet my eyes. All 15 acres of it. My siblings stood in the doorway of our childhood home, watching this strange inheritance ceremony with the kind of uncomfortable silence that follows a funeral. Except nothing had died here. Nothing except my father's hope that I might amount to something more than the family disappointment. The land was 3 hours north of everything that mattered, a stretch of stubborn earth that had refused every attempt at cultivation, every dream of prosperity that 3 generations of our family had tried to plant in its unforgiving soil. "What am I supposed to do with this?" I whispered, studying the faded ink that marked boundaries around what everyone called the wasteland. My voice cracked like I was still that little girl who used to hide behind the kitchen door, listening to my parents argue about money, about failure, about me. My mother turned away, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor with the finality of a judge's gavel. "Figure it out," she said. "You're always so smart, always so different from the rest of us. Make something of it." The words cut deeper than any slap could have. This wasn't generosity. This was exile dressed up as inheritance. That night, I sat in my tiny apartment, staring at the deed until the letters blurred together. The land had a name, Whispering Creek Property, though everyone in our family just called it that useless plot. My grandfather had bought it in 1947, convinced he'd struck gold with the price. Instead, he'd struck disappointment. My father had tried to sell it twice, but no one wanted land that couldn't grow corn, couldn't pasture cattle, couldn't even hold a decent foundation for building. I folded the deed carefully, placing it in the shoebox where I kept all my important documents, college diploma, birth certificate, and now this paper that felt like a certificate of unworthiness. My parents had given me their failure, wrapped it in legal language, and called it love. The years that followed were a quiet kind of suffering. I carried that deed like a stone in my pocket, a constant reminder of how little my family thought of me. While my siblings inherited the family business, the good china, the jewelry that had been passed down through generations, I got 15 acres of dirt that couldn't even grow weeds properly. I never visited the land. Why would I? It represented everything I was trying to escape. The small-town mentality, the acceptance of mediocrity, the belief that some people are just born unlucky. Instead, I focused on building a life that proved them wrong. I worked 2 jobs, saved every penny, and slowly, methodically, created distance between myself and the family that had labeled me their consolation prize. But the deed followed me everywhere. Through 3 apartment moves, 2 career changes, and countless nights when I questioned whether they were right about me. Maybe I was the family failure. Maybe 15 acres of worthless land was exactly what I deserved. The whispers started when I was 28. Subtle mentions from old neighbors when I'd visit our hometown for obligatory holidays. "Strange things happening up near your grandfather's old place," they'd say, their eyes holding secrets I couldn't decode. "Lot of activity up there lately." But I dismissed it the same way I'd learned to dismiss everything about that cursed inheritance. It wasn't until my cousin Sarah called me on a Tuesday morning, her voice breathless with excitement I hadn't heard since we were children, that I finally understood what everyone had been trying to tell me. "You need to get up to that land," she said. "Now, today. Drop everything and go." The drive north felt like traveling backward through time. Each mile took me further from the woman I'd become, and closer to the girl who'd been handed rejection, disguised as responsibility. My hands shook on the steering wheel as I turned onto the dirt road that I'd only seen in my nightmares. But the road wasn't empty anymore. Trucks lined both sides of the narrow path, their logos bright and professional against the dust. Men in hard hats moved with the purposeful energy of people who'd found something valuable. The air hummed with machinery, with possibility, with the kind of electricity that money brings to forgotten places. I parked at the gate, a gate that had never existed before, and walked onto my land for the first time in my life. The ground beneath my feet felt different somehow, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for me to understand what it had been hiding all these years. The foreman approached me with the respectful caution of someone who'd learned not to underestimate property owners. "Ma'am, are you the owner here?" His hard hat was pristine white, his clothes still clean despite the dust that covered everything else. "I am." The words felt strange in my mouth. After 6 years of carrying shame, saying I am the owner felt like claiming a crown I'd never believed I deserved. "Ma'am, we need to talk." He gestured toward a trailer that had appeared overnight, like something from a dream. "We've got some results you're going to want to hear." Inside that trailer, sitting across from 3 men in expensive suits, I learned that my grandfather's worthless land was sitting on top of one of the largest oil reserves discovered in our state in the past decade. The numbers they showed me didn't make sense at first. Too many zeros. Too much possibility for a girl who'd been raised to expect disappointment. "The preliminary estimates suggest your property could generate between $15 and $20 million over the next 10 years, one of them said, his voice careful and professional. "That's conservative." I thought about my father's trembling hands, my mother's clicking heels, my siblings' uncomfortable silence. I thought about 6 years of carrying their rejection like a scar across my chest. And then I laughed. Not the bitter laugh of irony, but the deep, cleansing laugh of someone who just discovered that the universe has a sense of humor after all. The phone call started that evening. My mother, who hadn't spoken to me in months, suddenly remembered my birthday, my graduation, every milestone she'd ignored. My father's voice carried a shakiness I recognized, the same tremor from the day he'd handed me the deed, except now it was desperation instead of disappointment. "Honey," my mother said, her voice honey-sweet with manufactured affection. "We need to talk about that land, as a family. We should discuss how to handle this together." My siblings, who'd spent years treating me like the embarrassing relative you only invite to weddings out of obligation, suddenly wanted to plan family dinners, organize reunions, strengthen the bonds they'd allowed to wither when I was no longer useful to them. But sitting in my apartment that night, looking at contracts that would change everything, I realized something that had nothing to do with oil or money or vindication. The land hadn't made me worthy. I'd always been worthy. The oil hadn't transformed me into someone valuable. I'd always been valuable. What had changed wasn't my worth, but my understanding of it. I thought about that 22-year-old girl who'd held a deed like it was a death sentence, who'd believed her family's inability to see her value was evidence that she had none. I thought about the years I'd spent trying to prove them wrong, instead of simply knowing they were wrong. The next morning, I drove back to the family home where this story had begun. My parents were waiting in the same living room, sitting in the same chairs, but everything between us had shifted. The power dynamic that had defined our relationship for decades was suddenly as outdated as the wallpaper that had been peeling when I was a child. "We made mistakes," my father said, his words careful and rehearsed. "Maybe we didn't see what that land could become." But I wasn't interested in their revision of history. "You didn't make mistakes," I said, my voice steady and sure. "You revealed who you were, just like I'm revealing who I am now." I told them I would honor the original spirit of their gift. They'd given me that land to get rid of me, to push me away, to make me someone else's problem. And it had worked. It had made me independent, strong, successful without their approval or support. I would take their rejection and transform it into the greatest gift I'd ever received. Not because of the oil, because of what carrying their disappointment had taught me about carrying myself. Today, when people ask me about the oil discovery, about the fortune that fell into my lap, I tell them the truth. I'd been rich all along. The oil was just the world's way of making sure everyone else could see it too. The real treasure had always been my ability to survive their doubt, to build myself up from the foundation of their dismissal, to find worth in a place where they'd planted only shame. That worthless plot of land had been the most valuable thing they could have given me, not because of what lay beneath its surface, but because of what it had forced me to discover within myself. I learned that belonging doesn't come from family acceptance. It comes from self-acceptance. That inheritance isn't about what others give you. It's about what you give yourself. The girl who'd held that deed with trembling hands was gone. In her place stood a woman who'd learned that sometimes the greatest gifts come disguised as rejections. That sometimes love looks like abandonment until you're strong enough to see it clearly, and that sometimes the most worthless things in the world are actually priceless. They just require the right eyes to see their value. I kept the land, of course, but more importantly, I kept the lesson it had taught me, that I had never needed their validation to be valuable, their acceptance to be worthy, or their oil to be rich. I'd always been all of those things. The earth had simply been waiting for the right moment to remind me.